Well, welcome back to the Canadian Virtual Sell Your Business Conference. My name is Mark Belache. I'm president of TorontoEntrepreneurs.ca. Really glad to be joined by Doug Robbins. Doug is the president and founder at Robbinex. Doug has spoken at this conference before and always has some very interesting updates. Today's topic is understanding the power of psychology when buying or selling a business. So, Doug, I know you got some great slides and looking forward to your presentation. If anybody has any questions for Doug, I will be back later, but you can type them in the event or in the stage chat area, and I'll come back a little bit later on to moderate any questions that come up. So, Doug, thanks as always, not only for speaking, but also being a sponsor at today's event. Make sure to connect with Doug. And take it away, Doug.
Okay, good. Well, thank you very much, Mark. It's always a pleasure to get together with people in similar businesses and talk about some of the experiences that we've had. I've learned a lot from the various conferences that I've gone to over the years, and I'm happy to share. Psychology is an important tool. Most of us sort of don't understand or sort of take for granted. My first exposure to it was back in the mid-'60s, right out of kindergarten, by the way, but I became a salesman for Bell Canada. And they sent me to school for 9 weeks to learn how to spell salesman. What they really were doing, and looking back, they were teaching me how to communicate effectively. And the particular communications they were teaching us was how to listen. And it's really significant what you can learn when you're in a listening mode. Now, we call that usage prospecting. That's another presentation. It's good for an hour. So we're not going to get into the how to listen program today, but I'm going to talk about some of the experiences we've had as a result of learning how to listen and how to use psychology. My first real exposure to a psychologist was in 1969. I'd left Bell Canada and I was looking for a new job. And I was interviewed by a company that sold computers, a company called Frieden. Most of you have never heard of Frieden, but they had early ad punches, and they had a computer they were selling that was it carried 56 totals. It was really miraculous. It typed at 141 words a minute, and it only cost $56,000 in 1969 dollars. Like if you move the decimal one, it gives some idea of the value of the things that we were selling. And when I was interviewed by the chap, he wanted to know if I'd be willing to go for psychological assessment. And I said, well, what's involved? I've never heard of that or done it before. He said, well, we're going to send you down to Toronto. You're going to spend a day with a couple of psychologists. They're going to ask you a bunch of questions, and they're going to send me a report and tell me whether or not they think you can do the job. I thought, okay, that sounds fine. I'm happy to do that, but I'd like a copy of the report when I'm finished. He said, no way, I'm paying for the report, so it's my report. I said, oh, I appreciate you're paying for it, but it's all about me, so it's my report. And I'm happy to share it with you, but I want a copy. He said, forget it. I said, okay, thanks very much. And I got up and I left. His office was in the back of a very long, narrow hallway. And by the time I got to the front of the office to leave, his secretary had been buzzed. And she said, Frank would like you to come back and chat some more. So I thought, well, okay. So I go back to the office. He says, okay, you win. You can have a copy of the report. I said, fine. So a couple, 3 days later, I'm down in Toronto. And literally I spent 7 or 8 hours in front of a couple of psychologists answering questions, doing puzzles, doing jigsaws, and it just seemed kind of silly to me at the time. They called me up a couple of days after that and said, look, you've done really well on the psychological assessment. Come on down. We'd like to talk about the terms of the job. So fine. I went down a couple of days later and sitting across from Frank, and he was telling me all the great things that they learned about me. And yes, and here's the terms and conditions of the job. Are you prepared to accept it? And I said, yes. He said, great. You can start Monday. I said, fine. Can I have a copy of the report? He said, no. I said, well, we'd agreed that you would give me a copy of the report. He said, I changed my mind. I said, go find another salesman to hire. And I got up and left. Once again, I walked down this long hall. Before I could get to the end of the hallway, the secretary had taken a intercom call from Frank, and she sent me back in to see him again. He said, okay, here's your report. And he tossed it at me. And it was about a 30-page report. But on top of the report was a covering letter from the psychologist of Frank, and the letter fell off the report and onto the floor. So I picked up the letter and I'm reading it, and it says, dear Frank, no doubt this candidate can handle the job you want him to do, but quite frankly, he won't put up with your bullshit. And that was written right in the letter. He said, I predict he'll only stay for 6 months. And I said to Frank, I don't know if you intended to give me this letter or not, but I handed it back to him and he looked at it and flushed up a little bit. And anyway, the psychologist was wrong. I quit after 5 months. Frank had a terrible tendency not to understand reality from the truth. And he lied constantly about all kinds of things that really didn't matter. And I moved on. My next job was with A&W Restaurants. And before they hired me, they also sent me to a psychologist for a psychological profile and assessment. And there was no question. They gave me a copy of the report. And I took the job and off I went to do my thing with A&W. Fast forward in 1981 or 82, I'm moving my offices. And I was in the office on a Sunday morning collecting files. And I was going through the bottom drawer of a filing cabinet, sitting on the floor. And I pulled up these two psychological reports, the one from 69 and one from 71. And I thought, oh, this is interesting. So I sat back and poured a coffee and read these two reports. And surprise, surprise, they described the attributes that I'd like doing, that I'd be happiest at, and most likely to be productive in, were the job descriptions of a business broker or a business intermediary. Back in those days, in 69, nobody ever heard of a business broker or a business intermediary. So they were describing the job functions of something that would make me really happy and satisfied throughout the rest of my life. And quite frankly, there was nothing wrong or irradiant about their reports. They described what I was doing to a T, and I was quite happy doing it. Later on, we discovered some software, which we'll talk about a little later. But since the 80s, I've now been using Psychologist. In 1982 or 83, I did a transfer of a flower shop from a father and mother to a son and daughter-in-law. And we did the transfer in, I guess, early November. The son had been in the business about 15, 16 years, worked with his dad right out of high school. And dad felt comfortable he could run the business. And dad and his mom hopped on the station wagon, went to Florida, and the transfer was just a matter of moving some paper around as far as I was concerned. And I get a call from him at the end of April, and the father said, "You better get your buns back up here." This business was up near Barrie or Aurelia area. And he said, "My son just blew $80,000, and the only time of year we really make money." He said, "I've had to come back and kick him out and take over the operation of the business." I thought, oh. So a couple of days later, I'm up and visiting with the father, and sure enough, the son had really blown it. They had just destroyed the business almost. So we found another buyer, and we're talking to the buyer, and I wound up in an interview with the son, and I said to the son, "What are you going to do when you sell the business?" He said, "Well, I'm going to go find a job with a florist because I really want to be a florist." And that kind of puzzled me. So we sent him to a psychologist. And the psychologist came back and said to us, "This guy doesn't know how to read a financial statement. He doesn't know how to manage a business, but he'll do well if he had a business manager to run the business with him." And as we drilled down to find out why he failed, we discovered that somebody had said you can't sell from an empty shelf. So in December, he doubled up in his orders of poinsettias. Well, if you don't sell a poinsettia before Christmas, you throw it away. He doubled up his order. He threw half of it away. And those were the kind of problems he was running into. He didn't know the numbers of his business, didn't understand the significance of it, and that's why he was losing money. We got a hold of the accounting firm of the company, had a long chat with the accountants. They had somebody who they knew who was in between situations who might be able to work with him. To make a long story short, we brought a controller, office manager in to run the business with the son, and I can tell you 35 years later, they're still operating the business. So the power of the psychologist really needs to be taken into account. Here's some interesting facts, okay? We use psychology for partnership formations, for intergenerational transfers, for hiring employees, all this kind of stuff. But, it's evolved substantially over the last few decades, so much so that it can forecast the propensity of somebody to fail at a particular activity. It won't guarantee that you can be successful because there's too many other factors beyond psychologist's control to make a business successful, i.e. technologies, environments, economy, all that kind of stuff. But if you haven't got the propensity to be successful at what you're doing, it just raises a big red flag. It can also predict the likelihood of failure in a partnership. We know that 4 out of 5 partnerships will have a life expectancy of about 3.5 years. And we've learned that over the decades. And I've been involved in a lot of partnerships, and I can tell you that for a fact that there's partnerships have a short life expectancy unless they're structured properly. And using psychologists, you can structure those properly. One of the things we do with the structuring is we want to have a clear delineation of authority and responsibilities. So partner A is responsible for these items, and he has authority to do those things. Partner B is responsible for those items, and they're responsible for doing those things. And the only time they cross each other was when they go to a board meeting, and they should have an independent board of advisors to keep an eye on the two of them. Another interesting fact is 67% of Canadians really want to own their own business. And not just Canadians, Americans. About 2/3 of everybody dreams at some point for 6 months to a year about owning their own business, yet a very small percentage ever do. And one of the reasons for that is the fear of failure, fear of the unknown, fear of things like COVID issues. And another reason they don't too is many people, father's been in business. Well, we know that an entrepreneur in his own business works an average of 68 hours a week. So the kids watched his dad work all the time he grew up, never had a lot of time for the kid, never went to the baseball games, the soccer games because he was busy working. And the son says, you know what, I don't need this kind of life for my family. I'll get a job as a lawyer or as an accountant or as a dentist or a doctor or something else. I'm not going to work those crazy hours my dad did. We know that 4 to 5 new businesses that started generally don't operate for more than 5 years. They're gone in 5 years. So they've either been sold, they've been merged, they've just shut down. And 80% of kids are not inclined to take over the business for the reasons I just talked about. Another interesting little factor is 7 out of 8 owners do have no exit strategy. And we'll talk a little bit about why they don't in a few minutes. But when they don't have an exit strategy, if you don't have a plan, you're not going to be able to execute on it very, very clearly. So since the fall of 74 when we started, and Mark, if you're watching, I got 46 years on you, so you're 46 to you're 35. But anyway, who's counting? You know, we're now working through our 7th recession. I started in 1974 in the middle of a recession, and quite frankly, I didn't know what a recession was. I have to admit that was kind of stupid of me, but I got lucky. And I'd left A&W restaurants and started my brokerage business. And my first transaction was to sell 5 A&W restaurants from one group to another group. And I made enough money. Well, let me put it this way. I made enough money to carry myself for 3 or 4 years. So it was a great transaction. But as we started moving through it, by 1978, Robbinex had 15 people on staff. We were just going great guns. We had 156 active listings. And I said, man, that's super. We are going to do really well next year. In this particular year, I'd made about $11,000 take-home profit. And I figured by the end of next year, I'd 5 or 6-fold that. By the end of next year, I did increase my profit. I got $12,000. And whoa, wait, what's wrong with this thing? So we started taking a long, hard look at the listings that we had. And of the over 150 listings, I went through and I valued each one of them. Spent 4 days in my jeans and doing a back of the napkin valuation each of these businesses. And only 7 of the value of the businesses were priced, or the asking price was within 10% of the real value. And that was a real setback. And what we learned was most of those businesses were priced for 2 or 3 or 4 times what their actual value was. The sellers were hoping they'd get a lot of money and they could just drift off into the sunset. And we were saddled with all the work of dealing with people with unrealistic expectations. We'll talk about that a little furthermore. So in 1979, early 1980, we said every business we're going to take to market needs to have a valuation on it. And in those days, we charged $500 for the valuation. Excuse me. And then we started using the psychologist. One of the files that we worked with was a farm distribution business. And this was a really interesting business that, just a quick second. Let me turn that bugger off. The father had run the business for about 40 years. His son was 38 years old. Father was almost 70. And the father came to me and said, I want to sell the business. I said, well, that's great, Bob. Why do you want to sell it? He looked at me and said, well, because I'm almost 70. I said, well, what about your son? He's worked in the business for 20 years. Can't we turn it over to him? He said, no, he doesn't want it. I've offered it to him. He wouldn't take it. So that's why I'm here to get you to sell it. said, let me talk to your son before we go to market. So I sat down, played a round of golf with his son, had dinner with him, and we talked about it. And the bottom line was the son said, look, Doug, I don't have any money. If I take over my dad's business, he's got to finance me. If I screw it up, I just ruin my pension, my parents' pension fund for the rest of their life. I don't want that responsibility. So sell the business. I'll be happy to work for whoever buys it, and I'll find a 5-year contract or 10-year contract, but I got to look after my parents. Well, that was a pretty hard position to argue against, and so we said fine. And about 3 months later, I had a buyer put a really good offer on the table. He subjected his offer to 2 or 3 things. One of the things he wanted was a 3 or 4 hour interview with the son. And so we set that meeting up for a Thursday morning at 10 o'clock. And the buyer said, I'll call you right after we meet. And 4 o'clock came, and 6 o'clock came, and 8 o'clock came, and he never called me back. And I thought, phone me first thing the next morning at 8 in the morning. He said, sorry to be so long getting back to you, but our meeting started at 10 and went till midnight. We had 14 hours together. He said, that kid is really smart. There's nothing he doesn't know or understand about the business. And they were buying product from Europe, and they were selling it through Eastern Canada. They had distribution centers in the East Coast and in Ontario, in Quebec, and dealers coming out of the yin-yangs, and they were doing really, really well. And I said, oh, that's interesting. He said, but I'll only buy the business if the son signs a 5-year contract. I said, well, I'm sure that's fine. He says, in 10 years, I'll give him the option to buy the business for me. I said, oh, why would you do that? He said, well, I don't have to pay you a commission. I kind of laughed. I said, oh, that's fine. Not to worry about that. But why are you saying this? He said, well, what he doesn't know and understand is how to manage the financial side of the business. He's never even talked to the bank manager. He doesn't understand cash flow, balance sheets, receivables, and all this kind of stuff. He doesn't understand how it interrelates. He says, in the next 5 to 7 years, I'll teach him how to do it. And I said, yeah, okay, fine. So then I phoned the father and I said, Dad, I'd like to send your son to an industrial psychologist to get a quick look at his psychological profile to see if there's any way we can convince him to take over the business. Dad said, you're sure? And I said, well, it's going to cost you $1,000, but at the end of the day, you have a better understanding whether you're doing the right thing or not. And so we were able to rush this son through a meeting the following Tuesday with the psychologist. The psychologist was really quick. He came back to me on the Thursday morning. He said, Doug, there's no reason why this kid can't take over the business, but he doesn't understand the financial side. He knows he's got to sell his product. He knows the price he's got to sell it for to get his margins. He knows that he's got to collect his receivables, but he knows everybody in the business. All he doesn't have is the accounting side of it. If you could find a good accountant for him, he should take over the business. I didn't have to look far for the accountant. His sister was a CPA. And so we had a long chat with his sister. We put a partnership together with a brother and a sister. And I can tell you that 40 years later, they're still running the business. So when you sit down and you look at this kind of stuff, the power of a psychologist is really significant. In the spring of 1994, we finished my 4th recession. And I understood the depth of recessions. In 1992, I lost $150,000. In 93, I lost $75,000. And up that far in 94, I was not quite break even. I was about 25 grand short. And I'm saying, you know what? I don't really want to be in this brokerage business anymore. And so I started looking around for another job or another business to buy. And I already owned a few businesses at that point. Over my career, I've had investments in 32 companies. So I wasn't afraid to go and buy a business. And I was on my way to the International Business Brokers Conference in Chicago that June. And I'm driving down the 401. I decided to drive to Chicago. I picked up a buddy of mine in Windsor, and we're going to drive down together and share costs. I get a call about Woodstock. And one of my clients has said, Doug, would you be interested in coming to work for us? And I said, well, what do you got in mind? He said, well, we're just having a board meeting, and we'd be interested in you coming in as a president and CEO and run the company, and we'll make it worth your while. And I said, what's worth my while mean? He said, well, we'll give you $125,000 a year, plus a new Cadillac, plus 10% of the profits, plus 50% of the common shares of the company. I pulled over the side of the road, and we had a long conversation for 10 or 15 minutes. And I said to him, well, let me get back to you on Monday. This was on a Tuesday night. And then I called my wife and said, I think I'm coming home. And she said, why? And I said, told her about the job offer. I said, I think I'd like to take it. And she was a very pragmatic person. She said, well, didn't you pay to go to the conference already? I said, yes. She said, you should go to the conference and say goodbye to your friends at least. Oh, yeah, she's right. She's right. I've been a member of that organization for 6 or 7 years, and I knew lots of people. So went down, picked up my friend in Windsor. And every once in a while, something happens in your life that's momentous. And as we're driving over the Ambassador Bridge, just about where the flags switch from the Canadian to the U.S. flag, I shared the story about the new job with my buddy. And he said, Robbins, I didn't know you were a quitter. I can't believe just because times are a little bit tough, you're quitting. And man, that was like somebody dumped a bucket of ice water over my head. It was really a traumatic, momentous moment in my life. And I can tell you the drive to Chicago was kind of quiet. We didn't talk about a lot of stuff. And when I got to Chicago, I'm talking to some of my buddies and saying what I'm going to do. This will be my last conference. And virtually nobody congratulated me. Nobody said that's a great idea. Many people question why I'd give up now just because we're coming out of a recession. The next few years are going to be good. They're going to be great. Rah, 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 rah. On the Saturday, the conference was over about 11:30, and I went for lunch with two of my friends, a chap from Seattle and a chap from Edmonton. And we sat down in a restaurant. And we started talking about the pros and cons of selling businesses. And after a while, the owner of the restaurant came along and said, okay, you guys have to leave. And we looked at one another and looked at him and said, why? I said, it's 2:30 in the morning. I want to go home. We've been sitting there for 14 hours just talking about the problems in businesses and selling businesses and all that kind of stuff. We stood in the street corner until 4 o'clock in the morning. And then we agreed that we would get together and really study the problems. And I can go on for hours about the problems, and I won't bore you with it. But one of the things that we learned was that the business broker had to have the skill set to master about 33 different job descriptions. I mean, wow. We did self-tests on everybody, and I could do all the job descriptions. My buddies had some they couldn't do. And so one of the guys said the next morning, let's break these job descriptions down into maybe 8 or 9 different jobs. And I flunked all 8 jobs. So we got down into the psychology of this thing pretty good. As a result of that, my 2 partners got out of the business. My 2 friends got out of the business. I decided to stay in the business. I started something called the 3-phase process. And we broke the selling of the business down into a series of steps. The first step was to get an analysis on the business, take it apart, understand it thoroughly, look at its strengths, its weaknesses, its threats, its opportunities, value enhancement opportunities, anything that might defer the sale of the business, next generations, the life after business, all this kind of stuff. And then we would write a report to the client, giving them a recommendation. The second phase was to prepare the business for market. And the third phase was to actually implement the marketing plan that we created in phase 2. And the program worked fairly well. I got involved in a lawsuit trying to collect a commission. And it was really interesting lawsuit. And we had sold a fairly large company in Kitchener-Waterloo to an American firm out of Boston. And the commission was $376,000, and the seller decided he wasn't going to pay. So we sued. And I don't mind saying that we won the lawsuit. In fact, that's another funny story. We caught the president of the company lying on the stand, and the judge took off his glasses. I'm going to have a coffee and a break. When I come back, I expect this matter solved. You see, the owner of the business was a lawyer, and he was caught lying on the stand. So he was going to lose his ticket as a lawyer. He was going to run into all kinds of other problems. And so we left the courtroom with a check. Well, I'm feeling really cocky about this. Yes, man, I just won the lawsuit. And I said to the lawyer who was working for me, I said, gee, Bill, would you mind taking a few hours and reviewing our contracts? This winning feels really good, and maybe we need to change a couple of words around and put in a comma or dot a T or cross an I or something, whatever you guys do with your legal stuff. And he said, sure. So he came down to my office about a week later, and I gave him all my contracts, and we put him through an abridged version of one of our workshops that we ran called How to Sell Your Business for Top Dollar. And he went away. And he called me up and he said, Doug, would you mind if I come in and interviewed some of your employees? And I'm thinking to myself, wait a second, I just want him to change and review the contracts. What do you mean interview my employees? But I said, well, okay, go ahead. Sure. Come on in. So when he came, and he talked to about 7 or 8 hour people, and he was there for, gosh, half an hour a person maybe. So he spent the morning with these guys. And a couple of days later, he said, hey, let's do lunch. Okay, fine. So we met him for lunch. And as I sat down, he said, listen, if anybody sues you, don't call me. Now, this guy had a really dry sense of humor, but he was dead serious. I said, what are you talking about? And he said, well, look, in your marketing programs, you'd say all these things. And he detailed all the things that we said, but you don't document anything. You don't take and prove that you've done what you said you're going to do, when you said you're going to do it, or how you're going to do it. There's no documentation. You really need to get some kind of documentation program in here, quality assurance program, record keeping program. Make a long story short, he recommended we ISO certify. And so we went through a certification program. It cost me $250,000. It took 2.5 years to get it done. And so our whole process is now certified. And what it's doing is it's taking away a lot of the element of how psychology can work against you. So documentation is a really important tool to have in your toolbox. Psychology has an enormous impact in virtually everything that we do. Okay. So to give you an idea, the comprehensive business assessment that I just spoke about is a wonderful tool. It allows us to get into the head of the seller as to why they really want to sell the business. And what's really on their mind, what their goals and aspirations are. Have they got a life after business plan? All this kind of stuff. The second thing we created was a program we call NAP, and it stands for No Asking Price Program. When we take a business to market now, we don't put a price on it. A bunch of years ago, a client came to us and we valued their business at $2.5 million. And he said, well, what do you think? I said, well, look, there's two brothers. You're in your early 40s, both of you. I don't know why you'd want to sell the business, because if you got $2.5 million, pay a little bit of tax, you each wind up with $1 million. In those days, interest was about 7%. So you'd get $70,000 your interest. You'll be bored out of your tree. You have nothing to do. And by the way, that $70,000 interest is taxable at max tax bracket. So you're going to wind up with about $35,000 or $40,000 in your jeans. Why don't you just keep running the business? You're making $250,000 each. By the way, $250,000 each times 2 is 500,000 times 5 times earnings multiple is $2.5 million. You should be better off to keep it. And they smiled and said, yeah, you're probably right. So they did. Fast forward about 2 years, they called up and said, look, we got a guy knocking on our door, wants to buy our company. We come and talk to him for us. And it was a firm out of the States that had a large operation in Cambridge. It was a 100,000 square foot facility, and they closed it. And it's a typical story of the left hand not knowing what the right hand was doing. And 90,000 square feet was manufacturing of the products, but 10,000 square feet was for repairing and maintaining products that they already sold. And when they sold the building and closed down the whole operation, they woke up and they said, my God, we got to service our products. And service the product, they had to take a transport truck, put it on a truck and send it down to Connecticut to get serviced, and extra costs and all the problems. And they were starting to get a lot of customer feedback, and their sales were starting to drop. So they decided they needed to buy a small company who could do the repairs. And they came to my client. And so the president of this company was sitting in my boardroom, and he said, well, what do these guys want for the business? I said, well, they've got a price in mind that's fair in terms of reality. What are you prepared to pay? He said, well, you're wasting my time. I said, what do you mean? He said, if they don't have a price in mind, I'm wasting my time sitting here. I looked at him and I said, sir, if you haven't got the ability to value what you're buying, you're wasting my time. Thanks for dropping in. So we had a little bit of a clash, and after a couple of minutes, he said, tell you what, I'll hire an evaluation firm to value it for me. Wonderful. They came back. He said, we've had it valued. We're going to give you an offer. We're not negotiating the offer. It's take it or leave it offer. It was really being tough, hard-nosed approach to dealing with it. And I said, okay, what's your offer? He said, $5 million in cash. The business's value had not increased over that period of time, that 2 years from the time we did it. And he said, we want the two brothers to stay for 3 years. And they cut their salary down from $250,000 a year to about $100,000 a year. And that was their rationalization for it. So we negotiated. The term of the employment contract was the only thing we could negotiate, because the price was take it or leave it. Mind you, they were going to take it. It was a great price. After the deal closed, I said to the buyer, how did you value the business? Do you mind telling me? Well, we used future discounted cash flow. And we took the business that we had lost that was going in the States. We put it on top of this business. We did the financial modeling of what this business would look like when we owned it. And then they valued it based on that. And so the key word here was the buyer was looking at the value of the business under his control and direction. And so that's a significant thing to keep in the back of our mind. It's really important that you understand where the buyer is coming from when you're putting a transaction together. And that goes back to my very, very early days in the telephone company when they learned and taught us how to listen. One of the things we're doing with buyers is we're qualifying them on what we call the 3 M's. Have they got the money? Have they got the motivation to buy the business? And do they have the management talent? So the broker's job is to understand where the buyer is coming from, because if the buyer hasn't got the money, you're wasting everybody's time. And the next thing we ran into was a lot of problems with lawyers and accountants, particularly lawyers. And so we created a program we call the bow tie program. And what it does is allows us to take total control of the situation once the negotiations are done, and control both the accountants and the lawyers on both sides of the transaction. That's good for a 20-minute presentation sometime. You can pick that up off our website. I think there's one up there now. So, excuse me. We developed a program called RASP to do acquisition search, strategic search programs. We developed a program called PABs, which is personal advisory boards. And all this is psychologically driven, believe it or not. You know, the PABs is really an interesting story. Personal advisory boards are designed to let the client have other people tell them what they think of their business. And the personal advisory board is a really powerful tool. We've used it dozens and dozens of times. And my most interesting story was a client who came to me and he said, Doug, why don't you and your wife come over to the house for supper on the weekend? And we want to talk a little bit about my future. So we went over and we met with him and his wife, and we had a nice barbecue. And he said, I decided to sell my business. What do you think? And I looked at him. I said, well, why would you want to sell your business? You're in great health. You're enjoying your business. It's making great money for you. He said, Doug, I'm almost 80 years old. I said, yeah, but you look like you're 60 and you think like you're 50. You know, he said, well, what if something happens to me? Well, we can cover that contingency with an advisory board. And if something happens to you, then we can put the advisory board up to full speed. They can oversee the business until we sell it or turn it over to your stepdaughter or some management buyout team. There's no need to rush out and do this right away. Oh, well, I don't know. The profit of the business was $4.5 million, by the way. So he called me up about 2 months later, said, get a lot of thought to what you suggested, and I'd like to try your advisory board thing. So in November 2018, we formed the advisory board. He brought in some of his key managers from China, from the United States, from England, and from Toronto, and we had a long conversation for 2 days to understand the mechanics of the business. When the meeting was over, the advisory board sat down and did some reviewing of everything, and they came to a really interesting conclusion. The conclusion was that the individual managers of the companies had lots of responsibility, but they didn't have lots of authority. His responsibility and authority wasn't aligned. It wasn't equal. In other words, they knew they needed to buy paper clips, but they couldn't order the paper clips. So we had a long conversation with our client, and we said, look, we want you to shift the authority, give a little more authority to these guys, not have quite so much yourself. Well, you know, we stepped on a hornet's nest with that one, but to make a long story short, after a number of meetings with the advisory board, he acquiesced and he agreed. Fast forward 9 months, we were at a staff meeting with all his key managers from around the world, and they announced that they'd made some changes. The sales went from 16 million to 17 million. Nice, but you know, not earth-shaking. But the profits went to $9 million. You see, there's some marketing programs in place, some pricing programs in place, some freebies in place, and a whole bunch of other things in place that the managers didn't feel were necessary, but the owner wouldn't give them up. When they gave them up, the profits doubled. An interesting thing about these profits, at $4.5 million on a, say, 5 times multiple, the business is worth what, $23 million. However, when the profit goes to $9 million, the multiples change because you're into a different buyer category. And with the team was in place operating the business, we didn't need to bring management in. And so the net value of the business went up about 9 times the earnings multiple. So 9 times 9 is like $80 million. So that's a business that's about to go to market sometime in that, probably next year, 18 months. But that gives you some idea of the power of psychology, the getting in the heads of the employees, is what they thought and how it was going to work, and understand why the owner was operating the way he was, all psychologically driven. We created long-term strategic planning programs we call 10-5-3, 10-year vision, 5-year set of goals to reach the vision, a 3-year set of plans to reach the 5-year goals, to reach the 10-year vision. It has to be updated every year because the world is changing so fast and changing fast. Technology is changing, markets changing, and so on. And we do some general business consulting as a result of this, all psychologically connected. One of the things we've learned is that in our 3-phase process, we now call it the Caseta process, the Caseta 3-phase process. One of the big things we learned is 14 alternatives to selling. And the big thing was that if 10 clients hired us to do that comprehensive analysis, only 30% of them were ready to go to market. The other 70 had a better alternative. Now, from a broker's point of view, I'm really happy about that because I don't want to waste my time on the other 70%. We do due diligence first. We use a virtual dad room extensively. We value from at least 4 different paradigms. And I think it's really important to understand there's a lot of things that come out of this. We did a file back in the mid-2000s, and it was a really interesting firm. They had revenue of $10 million, contracting type firm. And when we valued it, we said, this company's only got an EBITDA of about $250,000 a year and 10 million in sales. This business probably isn't saleable. And we said that to the client. He got really pissed at me. What do you mean? I paid all this money for you to tell me you can't sell it? And I said, oh, we can sell it, but you're not going to get anything for it. You need to fix it. You have got a flat operating plan. There's no structure in your company. When you leave, all management leaves. So whoever buys it is going to have nothing left. So you need to change the way you operate. And we gave him a plan what he needed to do. And I followed it up a couple months later. He wouldn't take my calls. I tried 4 months later. He didn't take my calls. So I thought, well, I guess I really annoyed this guy. Fast forward about 8 years, I get a call from him. He says, hey, Robbins, are you still mad at me? And I smiled. I said, I didn't think it was me who was mad at you. Well, whatever. There was a little disagreement there. He said, listen, we followed your advice. We got a president. We got 3 vice presidents. We got a controller. He said, my partner, I haven't worked for 2 years. Sales just touched 35 million. Can you sell us now? We sold it about 9 months later. And so what we had there was these guys thought they knew everything they needed to know about everything. And we took a different look and said, no, you're missing a whole bunch of things. Here's what you need to do. So once again, the psychology surrounding what we do as business intermediaries, as business brokers, is huge. Here's an interesting little piece. We look for impediments to sale. We look for value enhancement opportunities. Did you know that most businesses operate about 70% of their capacity, maybe 75%? A few businesses will operate closer to capacity, but most businesses have built-in capacity they can sell. If you do financial modeling, about a 20% revenue increase can oftentimes double the profits. If we double the profits, what do we do to the value of the company? Think about it. So, you need to get competent advisors in there. Take a look at your business. You need to make sure that your professional advisors are pretty good. What we find generally, the accountants aren't bad. They're really good at what they are, but we have a tendency to find that lawyers have oftentimes overreached their skills and their experience levels. So we need to get a good handle on your professional advisors. If your accountant's doing a great job of accounting, but can't handle shreds or can't handle complicated tax restructuring for tax planning purposes, then we need to support them. And we can put them in touch with other accountants who can work with them or other specialists who can work with them. Or sometimes we say to the client, look, you need a new advisor, full stop. No new advisor, we're done. But also look at family for successors. There's many times I've come close to selling a business, and all of a sudden the prodigal son came home. Oh, Dad, I didn't know you were selling the business. I really want to take it over. And bingo, my sale's gone and the son's taken over. So when we look at a business now, we look at the family right up top. And I can go on for hours and hours about that. I just got the sign and I'm running out of time, so I'm going to have to move along here. One of the other things that's important is life after business for the retiree. Remember I talked about the 68-hour program that most buyers work, or most sellers work 68 hours a year, and that's very true. I can tell you that I do that as well. So at the end of the day, what are they going to do when they sell their business? We had a file that we sold a long, long time ago. and it had been going broke. They were doing 10 million in sales, and they had a negative EBITDA, not a huge negative, about 50 grand a year, but it was still negative, and the bank wasn't happy with them. Make a long story short, we put an advisory board together, put in a management turnaround team to help them turn the business. And 7 months later, we sold the company for $7 million, 7.1 million to be precise, cash. And I thought, wow, we've done a great job. Isn't this wonderful? My client was almost bankrupt, now he's a multimillionaire, blah, 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 blah. About a month and a half or 2 months later, I get a call from the guy's wife. He says, I don't know how to tell you this, but Louis is in the hospital. And I'm thinking, my God, he's had a heart attack or a stroke. What's wrong with Louis? He tried to commit suicide. Wow, that's enough to stop you cold, right? So as we thought about it, well, what can we do? I mean, there's nothing we can do that I could think of. About 3 or 4 weeks later, I get a call from the head psychiatrist at the Toronto General Hospital, wanting to chat a little bit about this man's business. And we talked about what we did and how it worked. And he said, just as I suspected, your firm is the catalyst for his attempted suicide. Wait a minute, guys, what do you mean? He said, the bottom line is, he said, you took away his purpose for living. You sold the business, all his associates, his friends, his competitors, all these people created his network of social media, if you want to use a term. He had nothing to do. So he started drinking, became depressed, said, oh, what the hell, I'm going to commit suicide. He flunked at that because his wife came home early and she was able to get some help. So since that time, we take a long, hard look at the kind of life the seller is going to have after he sells his business when he's retired. Has he got a plan in place? Because if not, we want to spend some time to make sure that works. So we found that psychology is proven to be our most valuable working tool. You know, we've done some time studies on what I spend my time doing in what mode. And I've had the good fortune of owning a bunch of businesses. I understand accounting, tax, law, manufacturing, selling, processing, retail. I've got a good handle on a lot of stuff. But over 60% of my working time, I'm in the psychological mode. And that's what this is all about, power of psychology. In the hands of somebody who knows how to apply it. Now, I'm not a psychologist. I've taken some courses in it, but at the end of the day, we know the flags where we need to apply the psychology, and then we'll bring in a professional to deal with it. So the kind of psychologist you want is an industrial psychologist. I've shared with you about selling computers. I've shared with you about selling franchises. I talked about sitting on the floor. I've talked about the turnarounds that we've done. Okay, the problem with psychiatrists with my friend Louis. So we know that psychology is evolving and can forecast the propensity to fail. We talked about that. The likelihood of partnership failures. So let's talk about this in more detail. I got to work with a fellow named Richard Wolf, Dr. Wolf, probably for 20 years. He recently retired. And you can read this faster than I can speak it. And this is an important thing here. So when we get involved in psychology, we really want to understand the motivations. So they use a program called TACE. It stands for the Attentional Interpersonal Style Inventory. It measures 20 different motivational characteristics and the reactions and responses to it. And it does measure you against the norm. Now, the norm could be a salesperson. It could be a manager. It could be a technician. So we actually have a norm for business intermediaries. And so when we run a test for a potential employee to come with us, we measure against our norm, which is for business intermediaries. And you can quickly see if this person's going to fit. You know, let's look at some of the details. So when they start looking at the interconnectivity of these things, they all interconnect. That's really weird and wonderful to see how this stuff does. I took a 3-day course in it, but you know what? I still bring in the properly trained psychologist to deal with it. Let's look at some of the things they're measuring. They're measuring awareness. Can you effectively see what's going on around you? External distractibility. Now, I'm really weird. The average person's external extractability is somewhere in the 15 to 20% range out of 100. Mine's in the high 80s. And I had a problem. I remember sitting down with Rich in the late 90s or in the early 2000s saying, you know what, I'm having a terrible time getting work done during the day. He said, well, what do you mean? He said, I come in at 7 in the morning and I can just get a lot of stuff done till about 8:30, quarter to 9. And then I usually stick around till 7 o'clock at night. And I get a lot done from 5:30 till 7 o'clock at night. But during the day, it just seems to be a mishmash. And he said, oh, okay. And I never thought any more about it, and neither did he. But a couple of days later, I noticed he was reading my taste test. And he said, Doug, we need to have a chat. He said, your external extractability measurements right off the thing. And I've looked your office over, and you're sitting in the wrong place in the office. Your office is right here at the front. Beautiful office, by the way, and I was quite proud of it. He said, but you're next to the telephones, you're next to the photocopiers. Back in those days, I had a fax machine, the front door, all the employees came and went. Everybody was coming in out around. He said, we need to find you a better place to work. And I thought, oh, yeah, really? I said, what do you think? He said, I think you should go in the basement. I said, I beg your pardon? He said, I think you should go in the basement. I had a 200-year-old building. Those are the stairs to the basement. That's the area he wanted my office to be in. And I said, what, are you crazy? He said, Doug, stop and think about it. A little bit of paint, a T-bar ceiling, some carpeting. This could be a great office for you. And I'm thinking, this guy's crazy. I went home that night and I chatted with my wife about it. And she said, well, maybe it makes sense. How much would it cost to convert the office? I called a friend of mine over to take a look. And he said, a couple $1,000 to do the job pretty well. So I went ahead and did it. I wound up in an office that was about 350 square feet, which is a big size office. I had a small board meeting room in it. I had a nice Chesterfield couch in one corner, my desk. I had lots of space. And guess what? My productivity more than doubled. I didn't have these dead periods in the daytime when nothing seemed to be getting done. And so there's a lot to be done. And once again, a tip of the hat to the psychologist to know what was causing me a problem. You got to be able to analyze things, take a look at it. What's this mean? You got to be able to have some internal distractibility. So your own thoughts can't distract you. If they do, you're not going to get your work done. You got to be able to focus. You need to be able to reduce your flexibility. Okay. If your flexibility is reduced, you're not going to be productive. Information processing. Can you process information and integrate lots of new information quickly? What about rules and risks? I can tell you based on this chart whether you're a liar or a thief or a cheater or a coward. It's amazing. Need for control and leadership, self-esteem and confidence, physical competitiveness, decision-making style. How long does it take you to make a decision? I bought a building a bunch of years ago, and the office that we had, the old office I was talking about, we had filled it up, and we had people not properly located within the office because we didn't have any space. So I decided to buy a new building, and I looked at about 15 or 20 buildings. I decided almost to go to green space and build a new building. I was changing banks, and the new bank manager asked about our plans, and I told her what we were doing. She said, well, we got a couple of clients who are fighting. They're brothers, and they're going to sell their building. Why don't you go and look at their building? Oh, okay. So she called them up, introduced me to them. I went over to look at the building, 8,000 square feet on an acre of land. Building's about 7 or 8 years old. Pristine building in the parking for 50 cars, beautifully landscaped, perfect. I asked the guys how much they wanted for it. They said $750,000. I said, sold. Pulled up my checkbook, wrote a check for $50,000 to the lawyer in trust, based on getting the agreements put together, and I bought the building. Everybody thought I was crazy. Robbins, how can you buy a building so fast? I mean, God, blah, 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 blah. And I said, guys, I had a budget of $1,250,000 for the right building. This is the right building. If they told me they wanted $1,200,000, I would have bought it then. I don't mind saying that we did really well in the building. We've since sold it. I sold it for $2.5 million, but that's another story. So expression of ideas, you're prepared to share your ideas with other people. You're extroverted. You're not afraid to get out. You're introverted too. You can control express your anger and your confront. There's lots of pieces that we're talking about here. You express support. You encourage other people. You're self-critical. You're not afraid to focus over time. You can't make your decision today and change it tomorrow and change it tomorrow and change tomorrow. You got to be on a plan. That 10-5-3 program we spoke a few minutes ago about performing under pressure. You got to stay calm and cool. I can tell you that not too much rattles me anymore. So these relationships are really important. Just to give an idea how powerful this is, we had a fellow comedian wanted to come to work for us, and I had Rich interview him, and I was kind of keen on the guy, and Rich interviewed him. And normally an interview with the psychologist an hour and a half, and they were in the room from 1 o'clock till just after 5. And at 5 o'clock, the cops showed up and took the guy away. I said, "What the hell's going on?" He said, "Doug, this guy's crazy. He's right off the wall. His idea was to take a job here and come in with a gun and start shooting everybody." So hopefully they took him to a psychiatric hospital and I helped the guy. I never did hear any more about it. The Olympic committees for both Canada and the United States use this particular program to assess which contestants are going to represent their countries in the Olympics. It's that powerful. So we know there's 8 major motivating factors, and you can see these and read them as quick as I can. And these are the things that really motivate people. The greatest motivator of mankind: fear. Fear of the unknown. Fear of failure. Though that drives more things than you can shake a stick at. So you've got to make sure you're not afraid of anything. So we use the psychologist to assess key personnel and family members for individuals, people thinking of maybe buying a business, thinking of buying and selling a business, hiring people, training people. Should I take this person from the back room and maybe put him in the front room? Has he got the skills to be successful? The 4 levels of competence. Unconsciously incompetence, the lowest level. You don't know what you don't know. Life is wonderful. Ignorance is bliss. We've all heard that saying. Then you become conscious of your incompetence. You become aware of what you don't know. Then you become conscious of what you know. And I can always tell somebody who's consciously competent, because when I ask them a question, the brain goes in a fast search, takes 10 seconds to answer the question, or they'll restate the question to buy some thinking time. But then the worst position to be is where most owners are, is they're unconsciously competent. They don't know what they know. When you ask them the question, they got the answer, but they don't know what they know. So because they don't know what they know, they can't teach their kids. Because the kids are in the second level, they're conscious of their incompetence. The father's unconscious of his competence. So with this huge gap, fathers aren't able to teach their kids. Kids get ticked off. Father expected him to know something that he didn't know and act in a particular manner, and he acted somewhere different, and the old man gets ticked off, and the son gets ticked off, and the kid says, "To heck with you, I'm not going to work with you anymore," and they move on. So the most important thing is to be able to bring the conscious father back, an unconscious competent father back, to become conscious of his competence, so we can then determine what he needs to teach, so we can teach the person who's incompetent what they need to know. Once again, there's so many ways of dealing with this. We had a transportation company that we're dealing with, a large company that had about 150 trucks. It was in the 4th generation ownership. The 3rd generation still came to work every day. He was 87 or 88 years old. And the 4th generation was in his late 60s. His kids were 29, 31, and 34 years old. And the 3 of them were all working in the business. He said, "I don't know what to do with them. I want to put my affairs in order." Psychology went in and ran taste tests on them, and the kids all came out brilliant, really smart. Every one of them was capable of running the business, at least it appeared so. So we had the capacity, the desire, the motivation. So what do you do with it? So I'm really glad we're using a professional accountant in that one, because I wouldn't have come up with the $10 million question. The $10 million question is, if you had $10 million to spend, tax-free, you could do whatever you wanted for the rest of your life, what would you do? The 29-year-old daughter said, "I'd have a family. I might even think about getting married." The 34-year-old son said, "Man, I'd buy myself a flying hunt camp north of Thunder Bay, and that's what I want to do the rest of my life." The 31-year-old said, "I'd buy 50 more trucks." So it became pretty easy to determine who should take over the business of that family. We need to realize that the typical business owner doesn't have time. He's busy doing all kinds of stuff every day. He's the center of activity. Okay. He doesn't have time to do any detailed long-term range planning. And this just goes around and around in a circle. Too busy to think about stuff. And so when we start talking about maybe you should be selling your business and putting your affairs in order, he starts to think about the things he needs to think about. Does he need to do a comprehensive analysis? What's the business worth? Are there any impediments? Should I sell? Should I turn it to kids? And as you see, there's so many different things to think about. Give me a call in 5 years. I got to give it some thought. We call it the 5-year syndrome. It's a form of procrastination. So what you're going to do is if you, as an intermediary or any kind of a professional dealing with business people, an accountant, a lawyer, a wealth manager, take some time to learn a bit about psychology, and you'll find you'll stop wasting a lot of time. Your time will become more productive. Uses prospecting, which is another course that we run, teaches people how to listen to what the client isn't saying. Is a very useful tool. So we've used the psychological assessment for tools for over 30 years. And it's really, really proven wonderful for us. Actually, it's a profit center for us. We charge for the services now. You know, just to sort of wrap up a little bit, we had a candy company come to us. 2 brothers. Second generation. Father died about 2 years earlier. He was 80. Their accounting firm came to us and said, Doug, I don't know if you can help these guys or not, but they've spent $300,000 in legal fees and accounting fees in the last 2 years fighting. And I said, do you really want me to get involved? He said, well, you know, you can't do any worse than the lawyers or the accountants have done. I said, well, okay. Make a long story short, the one guy didn't really want it. He just wanted to make sure he got his money. So it was really easy to put a deal together and solve the problem. But it took the psychologist to get into the root cause of all the motivations of all the different people. So I'm going to leave you with one last powerful story. I had a chap working for me who'd been with me for 7 or 8 years. Brilliant guy. I mean, when I say brilliant, he made me feel stupid. He could walk into a business, go, smell, oh, there's the problem right there. Ian tried to create a program to fix it. And I could tell you dozens and dozens of turnaround stories we did with this chap. But we started having all kinds of problems. We'd have a staff meeting. We'd all agree we're going to do something. And the next thing I know, we are doing something different. I had staff coming to me and said, but we all agreed to do this, but Charlie changed his mind. Now we're doing something different. And one day he changed the route of the company on a particularly heavy problem. And I just said, you know what, I've had enough of this. And so I decided to fire him. All the ramifications of employment law that I have to deal with. So I called up Rich, Dr. Wolf, and I said, I got this problem. I decided to fire Bruce, or fire Charlie, I should say. And he said, really? We got to have lunch. Click. Rich's office was in Rochester. We're in Hamilton. Lunch, we met maybe once every 6 weeks, usually in Niagara-on-the-Lake at the Prince of Wales Hotel. This is 11:30. He just hung up. We're going to have lunch. Click. So I went down and have lunch with Bruce, with Rich, and we got talking about Charlie. And as we talked about it, he's reading Charlie's taste test and my taste test. And watching him read this was like watching paint dry. So I got up and I talked to the waitress, I talked to the bartender, I talked to the maitre d', and finally went back and sat down about 2:30. I said, what do you think? He said, I think you should take Charlie out for dinner tomorrow night and not talk business. What? Yeah, take him out for dinner and don't talk business. Wait a second, hold it. I want to fire him and you want me to feed him? And he said, yeah, something like that. Oh, I don't think I can do that. I really pretty well made up my mind. He said, Doug, tell me, how long will it take you to find a replacement for Charlie? Oh, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 months maybe. You're going to hire a headhunter to do it? I said, oh yeah, for sure. What will a headhunter charge you? I said, oh, 30 grand. Who's going to do the work of Charlie in the meantime? Well, I guess I'll have to do it. Well, who'll do what you're doing? Well, I'll have to put it off or just, hold some of it back. I see. When you find this right person, how long will it take you to bring him up to speed? Will it be able to start right away? Or is there going to take some time for him to come up to speed and understand what you're doing? So it'll take some time. How long do you think? I said, 2 to 4 months. Who's going to spend the time orientating? I said, well, I guess it'll have to be me. Who's going to do your job? So we'll let him once again get put off. He said, and how much is dinner going to cost tomorrow night? I mean, he nailed me. It was just priceless. I said, okay. I will take him out for dinner tomorrow night. We won't talk business. Dinner didn't happen until Wednesday night. And we didn't talk business. On Thursday morning, Charlie came in with a new suit, dressed to the nines, looked like $1 million. Attitude shifted. Everybody kept saying, what happened to Charlie? Friday was the same thing. Monday was the same thing. I called up Rich and said, what's going on? He said, tell me what happened. So I told him. He said, well, here's the bottom line. He's older than you. He came out as the senior partner in a major accounting firm when you're just starting your brokerage business. So this guy was smarter than you, better positioned than you. And he said, he can accept being your equal, but he can't accept being your subordinate. In the beginning, he was your superior. He can be your equal. He can't be your subordinate. If you want to have a longer relationship, you need to go for lunch or dinner or breakfast about every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks at the most, and not talk business. And that went on for about a decade after that. So just to give you some idea of the power of all this. Now it's a source of revenue for Robbinex. Some idea what we charge for it. And, it doesn't have to be our programs. There's lots of psychology firms out there that can provide some help to you. We've been around for a long time. And our goal in life is to do the right thing for the right client, make the right decision, the right time for the right reasons. And we're using our years of experience to help those clients create opportunities. So Mark, I don't know if I've answered a lot of your questions. I could go on for hours, as you probably know.
But you've got always great information, Doug. The stats, it's packed with so much great information. I have a number of questions, but I know we're out of time here, and we have a panel starting in a few minutes here, so we're gonna have to wrap things up. But just if you need to, I guess, Doug, on both ends, right? If there's a buyer or a seller, you're good to talk to either one, really, right? Yeah. All right, terrific.
Absolutely.
And I just wanted to also mention that if anybody wants a copy of the slides, that you can reach out to Chris at Robbinex, and he will be able to email it. You can email Chris G, CHRISG, at robbinex.com, and I will put that in the chat as well here, so anybody who's interested can throw that in here. So I'm going to just put it in the stage here for a copy of the slides. Email Chris. Email Chris. I'm just putting that in there right now. So thanks, Doug. Thanks for being part of the event as always. Great presentation, lots of great information. I'm interested, but in more information myself. But Doug Robbins, president and founder of Robbinex. Feel free to reach out to him. I'll be back in a few minutes with the panel that will be starting at 3:45 Eastern time, so in about 10 minutes. And you can check out, in the meantime, the networking area. We've got some great opportunities for you to connect with other people, as well as the expo area where you can check out some of the products and services that can help you, whether you're buying or selling a business. So thanks again, Doug. Really appreciate your time. And for everybody else, we'll hopefully see you in about 10 minutes or so here at the Canadian Virtual Sell Your Business Conference. Thanks, Doug. Thanks.
Good. Okay, take care, guys.